Water crept across the classroom floor in a slow, deliberate crawl, soaking the legs of wooden desks as the children instinctively lifted their notebooks to their chests. At the front of the room, Teacher Lani, 34, stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the map of Fiji peeling away from the wet wall. First, the corners curled, then the paper sagged, and finally it collapsed in on itself, as though the islands on the page were surrendering one by one. From a small radio near the window, a soft Fijian lullaby floated through the air. However, with every passing second, the melody was swallowed by the growing hush of incoming waves. Lani barely breathed. "I always thought storms made noise," she whispered to herself, "but this one crept in silently." Then, as if the room itself were answering her, the chalkboard cracked straight down the center. The sound was sharp but brief, like a fault line splitting open between the life they had known and the life slipping away. And still, the water kept moving. Yet it had not always been like this. Before the tides began claiming it piece by piece, Nabua Levu had been a village painted in sunlight. In those days, children raced barefoot beneath coconut trees, shrieking with laughter as warm wind chased them along the sandy paths. Meanwhile, elders sat together in shaded circles, weaving mats scented with pandanus, their fingers moving with the steady confidence of memory. At dawn, the fishermen pushed their wooden boats into the lagoon while singing deep, layered harmonies that rolled across the water like prayer. Everything in Nabua Levu seemed tied to rhythm: the sea, the work, the stories, the songs. Lani had grown up inside those rhythms. Every path carried a childhood memory. Every leaning palm tree had once shaded a game, a lesson, or a secret. Now, as the village school teacher, she guided the very children she had once played beside, determined to pass on more than reading and arithmetic. She wanted them to inherit belonging. Even so, tucked quietly beneath her desk sat a small emergency bag, a flashlight, bandages, bottled water, copies of important papers. She never pointed it out, but its presence was a silent admission that the world was changing. Along the beach, the children often drew the village in the sand: rows of homes, breadfruit trees, canoes, and the sea sparkling nearby. However, month after month, the shoreline in their drawings grew narrower. Sometimes the tide erased the pictures before they could even finish them. And so, almost without anyone saying it aloud, the bright colors of village life began to fade into the muted tones of warning. Soon, the king tides became their monthly visitors. Each time the ocean swelled, seawater slipped into the lowest homes and left the floors slick by morning. As a result, villagers began marking the waterline on tree trunks with charcoal and knife scratches. At first, the marks seemed manageable. Then they climbed higher. Eventually, the ritual felt less like observation and more like grief, like measuring a child's growth in reverse, except this time what was growing was danger. Because of that, the children started arriving late to school. Some came in damp uniforms, others carried baskets filled with the belongings they had rescued before breakfast. Lani noticed that their footsteps squished more each week on the softening ground. Even the playground no longer sounded the same. Where there had once been the dry thud of running feet, there was now the wet pull of mud. Then, one morning, a government inspection team arrived. Drones hummed overhead, circling above Nabua Levu and mapping the village's shrinking edges. The officials spoke carefully, but their somber faces revealed more than their reports ever could. Still, denial can be persuasive when hope is all people have left. "Maybe the sea will rest," some villagers murmured. "Maybe next season will be kinder." It was half prayer, half refusal. Lani wanted to believe them. Nevertheless, when she crouched beside the school building later that afternoon, her stomach tightened. Fine cracks had begun spidering through the concrete foundation. They were thin, almost easy to ignore, yet they spread in branching lines that looked like the quiet handwriting of time running out. She did not want to frighten the students, so instead of making an announcement, she turned concern into a lesson. The next day, she introduced a new classroom activity, packing a just-in-case grab bag. She laid items on a mat at the front of the room: first aid supplies, a flashlight, clean water, copies of important papers, a whistle, dry food. She framed it as a life skill, almost a game. "What would you carry if you had to leave quickly?" she asked with an encouraging smile. The children played along, but they were observant. Even if they couldn't name the feeling, they sensed that their world was slowly becoming something they might have to leave behind. Then came the night the lesson stopped being practice. The storm arrived without a roar. Instead, it slipped into the darkness on silent feet. Wind hissed through the trees and bent their shadows, yet no thunder followed. The quiet felt unnatural, which made it more terrifying. Even the bravest dogs in the village whined and pressed themselves low to the ground. By midnight, the seawall was groaning under the repeated weight of relentless waves. Lani, awake in her house, listened to the sound with a dread she could feel in her bones. Then, suddenly, the wall gave way. The crack was muffled but final, a deep, snapping thud, and seawater rushed through the breach like a thief, moving fast and low. Within moments, it swept across pathways, flooded sleeping homes, swallowed tools, and lifted woven mats as though they weighed nothing at all. Lani didn't hesitate. Because she had prepared for this possibility, she grabbed her emergency bag and waded through the rising water towards the school. Her heart pounded as cold currents pushed against her legs. Inside the dark classroom, she gathered what she could reach first: the lolly drum used for morning assemblies, the shell necklace passed down from the village's first teacher, and a small recording device filled with the voices of her students. These were not just objects, they were anchors, proof of who they had been before the water arrived. Above her, a lantern swung wildly from a hook, its flame trembling with every gust, and yet it did not go out. In that stubborn glow, Lani saw something the storm could not drown: endurance. By dawn, Nabualevu lay half-submerged. Clotheslines floated like broken flags. Mud coated walls, steps, and cooking pots. The lagoon and the village had become one blurred body of water. Therefore, when the elders gathered in the gray light, no one interrupted when the oldest among them finally spoke the words everyone feared. "We must go inland. The ocean has taken our home." The decision was necessary, but necessity doesn't soften heartbreak. Later, in the temporary classroom, a small, trembling voice rose from the back. "Miss Lani, if we move, will we still be Fijian? Will the ocean forget us?" At once, the room fell silent. Lani felt tears burn behind her eyes, though she fought to keep them from falling. The child's question pierced deeper than logistics, deeper than relocation maps or emergency plans. It reached the wound beneath it all. What happens to a culture when its land disappears? What becomes of stories meant to be told beside a shoreline that now pushes the storytellers away? Outside, the carved village totem leaned in the floodwater, half submerged. Its reflection rippled and broke apart on the surface, as if identity itself were struggling to remain whole. Lani took a slow breath. Running from the ocean didn't mean running from who they were. Still, if they were to survive this change without losing themselves, they needed a vessel that the water could not swallow. So that night, she stood before the community and proposed an idea. "We will build a digital canoe, a living place for our songs, our legends, our dances, our childhood memories, everything the sea cannot be allowed to erase." At first, the villagers looked at each other in uncertainty. Then, little by little, understanding spread. If a canoe had once carried their ancestors across water, perhaps this one could carry their identity across loss. As families packed for relocation, students used tablets and phones to record elders sharing blessings, folk tales, and laughter. Mothers filmed recipes. Fishermen explained the stars they once followed home. Grandparents sang to the youngest children so those songs would never vanish. In time, every captured voice became a paddle carrying the village forward. Thus, the journey inland became more than an escape, it became an act of preservation. On the morning they left, the air felt heavy with unfinished goodbyes. The entire community began the long inland walk, carrying woven bags, rescued keepsakes, and digital devices glowing faintly with stored memory. Their past rested in their hands and on their backs. Behind them, the mud held their footprints, forming a long, uneven trail through the earth. And with each step, a new truth emerged. Identity was not tied to one shoreline alone. It could be carried. It could endure. After a while, one of the children began humming the lullaby that had played on the radio the day the classroom flooded. This time, however, it was not a fearful whisper fading under waves. One by one, other voices joined in until the song became steady and warm, lifting the spirits of those walking in silence. Meanwhile, Lani moved alongside them, clutching the evacuation list she had checked 3 times at dawn. She counted children, matched them to assigned groups, and guided parents and elders along the route. Because preparedness had become part of her teaching long before the disaster struck, the migration did not collapse into chaos. It moved with order, care, and determination, the quiet strength of people who had planned even while hoping never to need the plan. By the time they reached the relocation site, mist wrapped the hillside where Seabreeze once had. At first, the new place felt wrong in every possible way. There was no salt on the air, no sound of waves against the shore, no familiar horizon. No sea breeze, no salt smell, one child whispered, clutching a shell from the old village. Lani felt the ache too. Even so, she forced a warm smile and gathered the children beneath a tarpaulin stretched between bamboo poles. This, she told them gently, is our school for now. What began there as a temporary shelter soon became the center of rebuilding. The digital canoe grew larger than Lani had imagined. Students painted bright murals of the drowned village, the jetty, the church roof, the mango tree that had hidden every childhood secret. Elders came each day to teach dances that might otherwise have vanished with the tides. At the same time, the youth mixed traditional chants with soft digital echoes, creating soundscapes that felt uncannily like the ocean breathing again. Then, one evening, the community gathered after sunset and watched as a hologram of the old shoreline glowed against the darkness. The sea appeared in amber light. The outlines of homes flickered back into view. Gasps rippled through the crowd. For a moment, memory and future stood side by side, and what had been lost returned, if only in light. Yet remembering the past was not enough. They also needed to protect the future. So the very next morning, the entire village walked to a nearby stream and planted mangrove seedlings along its banks. The children pressed the roots into the mud with surprising reverence, while the adults explained why mangroves matter, how their tangled roots hold the soil, soften waves, reduce erosion, and shelter life. This time, their tribute to the coast was not just symbolic, it was practical, living protection. In learning to restore nature, they were also learning one of disaster risk reduction's oldest truths. When communities protect ecosystems, ecosystems can help protect communities. Weeks later, the digital canoe was finally complete, a living online archive that allowed anyone, anywhere, to explore the village's stories, songs, dances, names, and memories. To celebrate, the community held a cultural night filled with drum beats, laughter, and the flicker of firelight against hopeful faces. Lani sat in the front row as her students stepped onto the stage. Their performance began with slow, traditional Fijian movements taught by the elders. Then, gradually, animated projections swirled around them, waves, canoes, ancestral patterns, constellations. The children moved through the light as though they were weaving past and future together with their own bodies. At the end of the dance, an elder stepped forward carrying a single candle. Without speaking, he passed it to a young girl. The flame trembled in her hands, but it remained steady. Everyone understood the meaning at once. The story had not ended, it had been transferred. And so, although the tides had taken their village, they had not taken its heart. Through preparation, memory, culture, and resilience, the people of Nabua Levu rebuilt more than shelter. They rebuilt continuity. They rebuilt dignity. They rebuilt a legacy strong enough to outlast water. Much later, Lani returned to the shoreline where the old village had once stood. Gentle waves lapped against what remained, a few broken posts, a submerged doorstep, scattered fragments of lives once lived beside the sea. The water was calm now, almost tender, as if apologizing for what it had claimed. She stood at the edge and watched sunlight tremble over memories beneath the surface. Then she spoke softly into the wind. The sea took our land, but it could not take our identity. We carried it with us, in our songs, our stories, and our will to begin again. She paused, letting the silence breathe. Preparing before disaster saves more than belongings. It protects who we are.